So let me start with a little bit of introduction for folks who don't know Margaret. Margaret, 2 years ago, joined the Washington Post as their media columnist. And those of you who've been reading her know that she always brings cogent and helpful perspectives to the various challenges that are confronting media today. She started her career in Buffalo at a local newspaper there and left Buffalo as the editor of the paper, the Buffalo News, and then spent 4 years preceding the Washington Post as the public editor at the New York Times, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with that kind of role, is in a sense the reader ombudsperson at the paper. So also, which gives her, I think, an interesting perspective on how readers perceive the publication, which I think is obviously an important question to us as well. So welcome, Margaret Sullivan.
Thank you very much. This is, thank you. This is a thrill for me because I've been angling for years to get an invitation to NewsGeist, and this is my first time here, so to be up here doing this AMA is extremely fun and exciting. So thank you very much. Thank you, Richard.
Oh, it's great to have you. And if I had known you were angling, you'd have been invited sooner. In any case, and as an AMA, this is open questions for all. We'll start the conversation. In fact, as I told Margaret, this is two ways. It's not just me asking questions or you asking questions of Margaret. I fear she'll fire some back at me as well, and that's all fair game. So to start, I wanted to, if I could, you wrote an interesting article last week that I particularly appreciated because the focus was indeed the Russian interference in the political landscape here. And, you know, as you've heard me echo my own concern about how we respond to this and how we should be cautious about attempts to solve problems with regulation. Not that some regulation might not help. I'm sure that could be the case. But the interesting thing that I thought you did in that piece, which was really to raise some of those questions. You know, where does sensible regulation turn into censorship? Where do free speech and privacy concerns, often at odds with each other, find a reasonable meeting place? And the third was, you know, do we really want the federal government dictating what social media companies, or for that matter, any platforms or publishers for that matter, can and cannot do? These are obviously the big and important questions that we need to wrestle with as we seek to address these problems. So given that, I actually wanted to turn that back on you because, I mean, not to challenge you, but you've been obviously studying the space. And so from your perspective, what do you think solutions might be?
So, you know, my editors will sometimes say, you know, you've written this column and now some of your colleagues are working on an enterprise piece about it, so please share whatever you didn't put in your column and tell them about it. And I'll usually say to them, no, actually everything I know is already in the column. And this is somewhat true in this case too. I don't really have the answers to those questions. This was pegged to the hearings on the Hill last week, and you know, I think as we consider what, you know, the misinformation, what are the words we're using now, malinformation, that's been spread on social media, particularly, I was focused on Facebook in this column. You know, some profound questions are being raised here. I really don't know the answers. I do think that I have found in writing about digital media that a starting place tends to be transparency. It actually solves it doesn't solve a lot of problems, but it makes a lot of problems better. And I don't know if, and perhaps this is something to turn back to you, I don't know if the platforms are truly capable of transparency left to their own devices. What do you think?
No. Well, again, I think I'm not going to try to answer for all the platforms because, as I keep saying, it's a generic term that doesn't deserve to be a generic term. Platforms are different. Obviously, Google as a search engine is quite a different animal, even from YouTube as a sharing platform. I think from our perspective, frankly, as I often tell people, what in a sense drives us is the trust of our users. It's those billions of people who come back to Google search every day. And if we're not doing the right job by them, we're going to have an issue. And so I think I completely agree with the notion of being ever more transparent in how we do our work. The ultimate question becomes, well, how transparent? Do you share the algorithm? Probably not. Do we provide better indications as to what are the principles that drive the algorithm? Absolutely. As you know, we've also worked hard at being transparent about, for instance, government intrusions, requests for data. Absolutely. And I suspect others in the industry would feel the same. You two also get into tricky issues of sharing data, sharing private information, and so on and so forth, which is always more complex than I ever imagined. As I've shared with some folks in my work at Google, where I often run teams doing algorithmic work, I spend a rather sizable amount of time on a very regular basis with lawyers going over the changes we're making to make sure that we don't even unintentionally and accidentally provide access to information or data that people can use to connect dots in bad ways. So these are complex challenges, but I think that's a very, very fair request of platforms that I would hope that we would all, frankly, step up in that regard. I mean, in general, I feel that's true across the media space, is that the more transparent we are, even journalistically, about how we do our work, about how we approach our work, is a path to trust.
So, I mean, in another observation I'll make, I'm not suggesting this is an answer, but it's a subject that I keep coming back to, is, given the fact that so many people get their news, and, here I am talking about Facebook more, given its outsized role in delivering news and delivering information to people, I wish that there would be more of a admission that Facebook seems to be a media company. It seems a no-brainer to me that it is, and so the denial of what's pretty obvious to me, and I understand why, but I guess I can tell you all day that I never worked at the New York Times, but it's simply not the case, and I think that some honesty about what's clear would be good. I don't like a lot of the language that I hear being used to describe what Facebook specifically is and does. It seems avoidant to me of reality.
I think the challenging question there, and I get asked that a lot. I did an interview on the BBC recently, and the interviewer basically said, there's this question about, are you a media company or a technology company? And, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then maybe you're a duck. And, my immediate response was, I look in the mirror and I don't see a duck. But that's obviously not the real answer. I think the real question there is, when one says that say, a platform, and in this case, again, important to distinguish, because Google search, the platform is the open web, which obviously we don't control. YouTube clearly is a platform where, in a sense, we do, as is Facebook. But even in those circumstances, you have to say, well, if you said, or if someone said, no, you're a media company, you have editorial responsibility for the content on your platform, then we should also keep in mind what that really means, because then you are asking those companies, and this gets into those tricky questions of basically making a determination of what's appropriate expression and what's not, right? On YouTube, where I believe the number now is like 600 hours of content are uploaded every minute and 1 billion hours are watched every day. 400 hours every minute? Thank you. It'll be 600 hours in a year. It raises the question of do we fact check, Washington Post videos that are on YouTube, as well as InfoWars on YouTube? These are interesting questions. These are things that we should all as well understand. I think it's kind of simplistic to just suggest, oh, you're a media company, you should be responsible, because I don't think we necessarily understand how that really plays out.
That's fair. I guess I'd like to see us at least have that as a starting point, because it seems impossible to deny, in my opinion.
Yeah, but I mean, again, it's that. A lot of this gets into what are the current legal constructs regarding what those terms mean.
Right.
Right. Because it's one thing to say, oh, you're responsible for your content as a news organization, versus being responsible for your content as an expression platform that's very, very broadly used. Yeah. With the scale that we're talking about. As I've, and just to share, like, one of my own frustrations when we get into discussions about disinformation is that we tend to look at, and it's obviously it's a huge issue, and it's a very emotional issue, and understandably so, is we tend to look at it as disinformation is all that stuff from the other. Like from Russia or from the bad guys or whatever. But, one of the things I come back to is that MIT Media Lab study that said, in terms of the election, that the bigger influence on the influence on the election wasn't fake news. The influence on the election was tremendous amounts of hyperpartisan content. Right, and so that gets into very interesting questions. You go back to say, do you, where do you draw the line in terms of political expression that is often misleading and spin, right, or even opinion journalism that is often not right, necessarily fact-based but opinion and spin.
I understand that, and I know that those are tricky areas, and yet I do come back to my basic idea that there is such a thing as verifiable reality, and that it would be nice if we could stay fairly close to that when this is such an influential area that is capable of changing our society in such profound ways as we've seen. So I don't have the answers. I guess, as a word person and a language buff, and I like to see us acknowledge the obvious. So, and maybe use that as a starting point. But we don't have to.
No, I think that's
out right now. But that's kind of where I'm coming from on it.
And no disagreement on that. And and as certainly folks who've talked to me about these issues, I take a very big step back and say, to what extent do we need to rethink, in a sense, what journalism is and how it presents itself? Right? We live in a very polarized society. One of the interesting things I see in analysis of like feedback to us, say specifically to Google News, not surprisingly, we see feedback messages saying, why is Breitbart.com in Google News? Why is Russia Today in Google News? We also see surprising amounts of feedback saying, why is the fake news Washington Post or fake news New York Times or fake news NPR, in Google News? So these are interesting questions, and frankly, what I wanted to put back to you, and I've had, very superb long conversations with Marty about this at the Post, is how do you look at the brand of the Washington Post in terms of how you do your work and present yourself to, in a sense, also regain the broader trust of audiences beyond those who, are comfortable with your reporting because they generally agree with it? Right.
Well, one of the ways that the Post is changing, I think, is in trying very hard to, there's a poster around the Post right now that's a quote from Marty, and it's just sort of a finger, and it says, go talk to people. And I think the Post is trying to do a much better job of talking to the whole country. And it's been an explicit, mission to realize that, and I think this was true at the Times and other places, that we are in something of a bubble, and the fact that we were all, I mean, maybe not all, but many of us were so surprised on election night and believed the polls and hadn't done as much, true understanding of what the feeling was in the country and why, is a lesson that I think actually has been pretty well learned. Not entirely learned, and you can't learn it overnight or even in a year, but, the Post has something called the America Desk, and it really is trying to do much more reporting throughout the country. And, we know, and I've heard conversations about this around the rooms today, that journalists are so concentrated in New York and Washington and on the West Coast that, and with local news being as strained for financial reasons as it is, this is part of the problem, and it's something that we can address by getting out there more, not by parachuting in, but by actually spending time there and having people who maybe grew up in that community. I mean, one of the weird things for me is that I spent almost my whole career in Buffalo, but because I then went to the New York Times and now the Washington Post, people are like, well, you're that thing, that Acela corridor person, and I'm actually like a Rust Belt person. So, I think to the extent that we can really try to understand the communities that we're covering by being there more and by having diverse newsrooms, not just racially, not just about gender, but about, ideological diversity. Do we have any people who are have been members of the military? Do we have people who own guns? All of that stuff, we need to do a better job so that we're not in our little, very contained bubbles.
One of the things I know that the Post has done in terms of, again, how do we present information to our audiences, whether it be a publisher or for that matter, say Google Search or Google News, is that you imposed a much stricter, reduced set of labels on your article types. So if you have opinion and analysis and so on, whereas before, you got a column like fix it, and like how does someone understand the difference between these various things?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that a little bit.
I'd love to get your perspective, honestly, because I know these are not necessarily binary things. They're soft boundaries.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I've tried to foster, and including in our work at Google as things evolve, is, we talk a lot about media literacy, but can we, in how we present content, frankly, should you need a user manual to understand the nature of the content you're seeing?
Yeah.
It pains me, frankly, when we surface results or things on Google News, that there's an opinion piece being surfaced at the top of the stack as if it was news coverage,
right,
in the true fact-based sense of it. Now, sometimes I think, is that too simplistic and naive? I don't know. But I somehow feel if we don't establish new norms, I don't see how we have a prayer at reestablishing a sense of trust. But what's your perspective on it?
One of the things that we've learned is that, and certainly one of the things I hear when I talk to people, is that they don't want news and opinion all blended up together. They'd like, a lot of news consumers will tell you, can't you just give me the facts? Would you stop editorializing all the time, even if they don't use that word? That's kind of what they're saying. And in the newspaper world, we used to somehow think that we could use this bizarre, coded, strange sorts of small things to signal to people what they were reading in an absurd way. Like, we used to run the type ragged right, which meant that it didn't go to the end of the column, right? And that was supposed to tell you that this was a feature story or an opinion piece. Only we knew this, but they didn't know this. Maybe in some subconscious way they might have learned it, but I don't think so. Or like that it had an italic, if it had an italic headline and it was ragged right. Well, that was clearly going to be an opinion piece. I don't think people know that, and I don't think, now when everything is so disaggregated and, things are coming across your feed, coming across your phone, I think we have to do a much better job of saying, this is an editorial that represents the Washington Post editorial board's thinking. It could have a tagline. It could explain it. One of the things that the Post has started doing, to my great relief, is putting a little bug on my columns that says perspective. And I found, it was really dramatic. Before I had that, people would always, complain to me. I'd get all this email from people saying, it's so terrible that you have an opinion. It's so terrible that you're writing this opinion crap. And I would think, but I write a column. I'm an opinion writer. And so now it says perspective, and if you hover over it, it sort of explains what that means, which is this is a person who has a point of view, and that's what this is. And some things will say news analysis, and some things will say something else. But I actually saw a dramatic difference. Like, people do understand now that, this is an opinion piece, so it's okay that she has an opinion. So I think that the more we can label things and the more we can help people in quick, ways that they can intuitively, get. And I think we help people feel smarter about what we're presenting to them, and it's important to do that because, we do have things that are essentially straight ahead news and presented factually, and people are frustrated when they think they're getting that and are actually getting, Eugene Robinson's column or something like that. So I think the more labeling and the more explanation we can do, the better. And that actually is a form of transparency, I think, too.
Get your questions ready, and I just want to, while waiting for that question, I don't want to steal Sally Lehrman's thunder, but I know one of the things that the Trust Project will be recommending when they announce in a few weeks is indeed article-type tagging, which I know we would love to see because it'll help us go beyond some of the guesswork we do today to better represent that stuff.
Yeah.
And to your point, I think we have a responsibility to do that. And I, at the same time, I think we could use some assistance in that regard. Questions? Scott Lewis. We have a mic.
Yeah, over there. She's running it.
So, Richard, this is kind of for you, but for Margaret as well. Like, one of the problems with leaving it up to the people to sort of decide about content and being neutral as a platform is that there's no outlet, there's no human for people to talk to about those decisions that are being made, because you are prioritizing content, you are putting things, you are making connections. There are decisions being made that people don't understand. And when it's a newspaper making those decisions, there's a person, there's at least somebody you can talk to and you can trust that. Would you consider actual tools that people could use to hurt or punish content or otherwise indicate what their feelings are about it? Like Reddit has a way to downvote things and it almost disappears. There's no way to do that on some of these platforms, and I think it creates a helplessness that we all deal with. We can email Margaret about her choices or about the priorities of her paper, but we have no way to do that for the platforms. And if it's up to us to decide on the content, it seems like we might have a role.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And in fact, we have been expanding means to provide feedback. Whether it be on a result set or whatever, is let us know what's wrong. I think that's obvious. I think it's a very important point that I'm sure we can further expand from the approaches we've taken. It's always a trick when you get feedback because, of course, you got to parse through it's why one is, you're careful about putting, thumbs up, thumbs down on things, because it gets gamed and spammed and people want to attack a source and they go after it. But that doesn't mean, what I particularly like is the feedback that allows people to kind of give us some really direct information that we can then, parse and hopefully turn into some learnings. And I think, as we've probably communicated in other forum, and we've published the guidelines, is we do use lots of raters to help analyze our result sets, to just help us guide our algorithmic work. It's not down to the article level, but it's down to, are we surfacing the right kinds of things? But no question, more can be done.
Maybe Google needs a public editor. Just a thought.
Danny Sullivan did join us indeed as our liaison. But I think that's, I'll answer that question directly. I think we need, and I don't think it's necessarily in one person. But yeah, it's great to have Danny on board, who will, one of his objectives going forward is indeed, how do we educate people better on what we do in algorithmic search? No. And it's one of the reasons why I do what I do, for the same reason. Like, how do we engage with people, whether they be the publishing community or the general public, without question.
Yes, thank you. I'm Terrell Jermaine Starr. I'm a senior reporter with The Root, and I write about U.S.-Russian politics. I'm particularly, this is for both of you, but I'm particularly interested in your response. I want to ask you, what critiques do you have about journalists who cover Russia, who cover the Russian hacking story, particularly the acceptance of the U.S. intelligence community that Russia did, in fact, meddle in the election, and some pushback? Particularly, you have people like Greenwald, from the Intercept, who is very skeptical of it, right? Because we don't necessarily have like hardcore evidence of what the hacking patterns have been from Russia. So as media people who accept the U.S. intelligence community's assessment, do you have critiques about media people, of journalists accepting it? And I want to know, and also, do you feel that there is some unfair approaches that journalists take when discussing Russia meddling, like
Yes.
lesson learned from it? Yeah.
Yep. Great question. I mean, I think that, one of the highest values of good journalism is skepticism. And one of the things that we learned, or should have learned, in the run-up to the Iraq War was not to accept government representatives at face value and to question. And so from that point of view, I think it's been extremely important, should have been, and remains very important to be, to hold our fire to some extent, to demand and request and get as much hard evidence and verifiable fact as we can, to certainly to question the intelligence community and not take what they have to say at face value, and not to allow the whole subject to be politicized because, maybe some media people don't like this president and would like to see, something happen that would undo, what's come to pass in the voting booth. So while I think this is a very important line of questioning, and we're starting to see what's coming out of it, we can't get swept up into this kind of something that has at times verged into a kind of red baiting. Anything that has anything to do with Russia must be, by association, wrong and evil. So I think your question is great, and my answer to it is that skepticism and deep questioning is of perhaps our highest value as journalists.
I think, by the way, just to toss in a thought on that, certainly from various sources that we've looked at, I don't think there's any question about what's coming out of Russia. The only thing that concerns me a bit is that there's almost an over-focus on Russia as if that's the only source of what's going on, right? And it's obviously not just Russia. It's not necessarily outside the domains of our country. Right?
Could just be a 400-pound guy on his bed too, right?
Yeah. Well, and political actors who are obviously taking advantage of the same kinds of capabilities that they are to influence people.
Do you see any difference in the lead up to Iraq, the over-reliance on government officials' word per se, right? Because with hacking, it's a little bit different in that you don't necessarily, cyber and spying is an extremely secretive, realm, right? And so, do you like the concept?
Yeah, they're very different situations. I think the thing that ties them together in my mind is we have to be very careful not to be gullible and to constantly question, and to learn that lesson that was so clear, that this information that many news organizations were running with and putting on their front pages and writing editorials about, and beating the drums of war about, turned out to be untrue. They seemed kind of true at the time. They weren't. So, what did we learn? It really hasn't been all that long, so we shouldn't have forgotten it.
So this is a question to Margaret as the public editor of the New York Times. So much has been said in the last week by the media and Congress about the responsibility of the platforms, especially the social networks, in enabling Russian hacking and programming of the American electorate. But I want to ask about the responsibility of the media as well, because if you take New York Times and Nate Silver, they were running these poll trackers with showing Hillary winning till the last week, and then that may have created a sense of complacency in the Democratic voter base and might have had an impact in the election. There was also wall-to-wall coverage of Trump rallies, which went well beyond the needs of journalism and became a way to drive up the ratings. So all of that did have an impact on the election, and what do we say about that?
I mean, I think the campaign coverage was deeply flawed in many ways. I think that CNN, for example, and we know this. I mean, this has been quantified. Gave Trump incredible free exposure during the primary. You'd see, this, but you'd see the podium waiting for him to arrive. You can't buy that, actually. I've criticized major news organizations, and certainly I wasn't at the Times. I had already moved to the Post at this point, but the coverage of Comey's, October surprise, with basically the whole front page devoted to what he had said and the reaction to it, I think was way overstated. So, the media is very flawed and made a lot of mistakes, I think, during.
Do you think they'll change their ways in the next election?
I'm sorry?
Do you think they'll change their ways? Is the media going to change?
I mean, it changes a little. I don't think that, I haven't seen, in the case of CNN, I think, Jeff Zucker sort of acknowledged that maybe they overdid it with Trump. It's bizarre, actually, the amount of good and help that Trump got from CNN and the way he, now treats them like enemy number one. It's really unbelievable.
Ironic.
I think that I haven't seen anyone at the New York Times say that they overdid it with the Comey coverage. I haven't seen them say maybe we, used a little false balance or false equivalency in overplaying Hillary's email issues, which was a story that they broke. So, I think in order to reform, you have to accept that you might have done something non-ideal, and I haven't really seen a lot of that.
So
we're not very good at looking at ourselves in that way.
You mentioned to me earlier, you've got a column coming out tomorrow Right, it's been a year now since the election, and your column tomorrow is your assessment of the media's coverage of the Trump administration. You care to share your
Sure, I'll
conclusions?
do a preview. So, I mean, right after the election, this is not my original phrase, but, you know, and you've probably all heard it, but the idea of, you know, I urged the news media to scrutinize, not normalize Trump. And my assessment of the year of coverage is that we actually did both. And this is looking at, you know, the reality-based press, as I like to call it. That we did, in fact, scrutinize, you know, and in many ways, you'll hear people say, oh, we are in a new golden age of accountability reporting, and that is true to some extent. There have been incredible scoops, there's been great, you know, great digging, and it's been important and it's mattered. But at the same time, I think we've allowed ourselves to be hugely distracted by the noise machine that is Trump, that is his tweets, that is this, you know, he says something, you know, someone else debunks it. We spend 3 or 4 days going back and forth over, you know, whether this was true or not. Here's the fact checkers, and, you know, let's bring these people in. You know, what is Kelly saying? Can you question a 4-star general? You know, it goes on and on for days. And meanwhile, over here, you know, this major consumer protection has been removed. And we did write a story, you know, the stories were written about that, but what were we focused on was this dramatic craziness about something that, you know, deserves coverage, but we don't seem to be able to prioritize very well. I don't think we've actually figured out how to cover such an unusual president.
Yeah.
So I think we've both scrutinized, that's good, and normalized, that's bad.
In fact, I sometimes wonder, you know, I was like, Phil, is there some master plan somewhere? Is there almost an intention to distract us? I'm not saying the press. I'm saying on the political side, distract us from the important matters with the trivial.
Yeah, I mean, I ask myself that question, you know, is there really a grand plan here? I mean, is he doing this on purpose, or is it done on a gut level, or is it just his way to be constantly putting all this stuff out here and we're allowing ourselves to fall into it? I mean, I think we've overcovered his tweets. Obviously, they're presidential statements. We have to cover what he says, but I don't think we have to react to every tweet like a 5-alarm fire, and we do tend to do that.
Rusty?
Yeah, I'd like to go to the business side of journalism. And the Washington Post has been fantastic in the past couple of years about converting digital users into subscribers. Part of that has been bundling that with Amazon Prime. And what we're all looking for here is ubiquity. And Washington Post has that through Jeff Bezos. The Buffalo News through BH Media does not have that.
Right.
Is there any, and you're not going to speak for Mr. Bezos, but is there any ambition here to move this kind of subscription model beyond just what Mr. Bezos owns? Because the rest of us are living in a world where Google is in this space now, Facebook is in this space, Tony Hale, who spoke earlier, is in this space, the founder of Square, Jim McKelvey, is in this space. It seems like what we're all looking for is ubiquity so that we can find a way to pay for our content outside of adjacent advertising. And I wonder, is that conversation happening at all at High Table? And if it's not, it really fucking needs to.
I mean, I'm not exactly sure what you're suggesting. Is it that the Washington Post should be thinking about helping regional newspapers do their, you know?
If there were any way for us to bundle subscription engines with Amazon Prime or iTunes or anything that was ubiquitous and already a currency going on and not something we have to invent from scratch, that is table stakes. And that's what we're lacking right now, because we're all trying to figure it out from 170 companies coming at it at once, rather than some kind of currency that's already been agreed upon
Well, I know that Marty Barron, my boss, the editor of the Washington Post, is very aware and very concerned about what's happening with local news. He came from the Miami Herald and the Boston Globe. I mean, he's hyper aware of it. I don't know that the Washington Post or that Jeff Bezos is taking this on. I mean, if they are, I don't know about it, but I know that it's a concern. I don't know if it can be, sort of our concern. I think in a general way it is, but is that what the Washington Post should be focused on? I don't know. I mean, it doesn't make immediate sense to me that they would. I think it's a hugely important subject. I mean, I was the editor of the Buffalo News for 12 years. I was doing it, I was there in 2008 when the advertising model really fell apart. I survived, I administered round after round of buyout. It's pretty tough to see this happening across the country, and I think that it affects our democracy hugely. So, nobody has to convince me that it's a huge problem. I don't know the answer. I mean, the owner of the Buffalo News is Warren Buffett. So I've had a couple of billionaires to deal with, and I have talked to Buffett about this a little bit, and he's not tremendously hopeful about print newspapers and where that's going. I wish I had the answer to that. I really don't.
I do. I mean, that's a great question, and as you know, we've been having various conversations about that. We haven't, I don't think, come up with an answer, but I think the notion of doing what I think of as smart bundling makes a lot of sense. I do think that's an area where folks like us can conceivably play a role. Some people like to toss around the notion of Netflix for news, which I think is completely nonsensical, but that's another conversation. But the notion of being able to pair like national and regional or local brands into bundles by willing participants, I think there's really interesting potential there. Now, as you know, various publications have their own strategies with regard to how aggressively they're willing to bundle or not. Frankly, I've never met a local publisher who wasn't comfortable with the notion of, can I be bundled with a national brand? So I truly would like to, I hope that we over the next year or so can come up with some approaches that make sense there.
And it better happen fast, because it's, as you know, it's moving at a very fast pace. So the time is of the essence.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Hossein. I'm the co-author with Claire Wardle of the Information Disorder Report. As a non-American, I'm very surprised about parts of this dominant debate now, which is, I think there's too much expectations from the media and maybe even platforms to compensate for what is usually the job of government in many other parts of the world when it comes to literacy, media literacy, and even defense against hacking and those other intrusions. Do you see this as normal?
Nothing's normal anymore, you know that. I do think there's a tendency to want to blame the news media for almost every evil in our society. So, should the news media be trying to help news literacy? Yes, I think so. Is it our responsibility? Not entirely, but I think we can play a part in it. I agree with you, though, that it can't simply be the media's problem and simply be the media's mission to fix it.
So, as you noticed from the Snopes presentation, I should say, the level of intelligence out there is questionable.
Spotty.
Spotty would be a good word. I do think it's in all of our interests to try to address the questions of media literacy, right? I don't think it's anyone's specific responsibility, but I think from a perspective of the media and our platforms, like I said, I look at our business as trust is at its core. Right? Your business, trust is at its core. And if we don't recognize the need to help people understand how we do what we do or how they interpret the information they see, whether it's in a Google search result or on the front page of the Washington Post, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Right? So I think we all have to figure out what are the right approaches to doing that. And the only thing I'll say on that is I've had, is like, this is not just about teaching kids in schools. I mean, it's a great place to start, but obviously we've got huge populations that could use a bit of guidance in that, and I think we need to, in smart ways, try to affect that.
So speaking of trust, and something Margaret said about we don't do a good job when we get things wrong of admitting it, I'd love to know each of your personal experiences with being vulnerable, either in your column or your newsroom being vulnerable or Google being vulnerable, and was it actually a plus? I think we all kind of see vulnerability just knee-jerk as a weakness, but can it be a strength in creating trust?
So it's really hard to admit you're wrong. And I think it's just human to want to immediately, write a position paper on why we were right. There have been times when I've had to, clearly say that I made a misjudgment and got it wrong, particularly in an episode as editor in Buffalo where and I guess I should say I, overplayed a story that was insensitive to the African American community in Buffalo. It resulted in some victim blaming, essentially. I wrote a piece about it for Neiman Reports, so I have kind of taken it public. But I ended up going out into the community, talking to a lot of groups. I ended up writing an editor's column that, and taking a whole bunch of steps to address it. It was really painful. It was really hard to do. And it was, I learned a lot from it. But I wouldn't say that, if you told me tonight that the column I wrote last week or the one that's going to be in tomorrow is really bad and I should deal with the problems of it, I wouldn't say, oh, great, I can't wait to learn something. It's hard, and one of the things that I found as public editor of the Times is that it's almost like the higher up you go, the more difficult it is to say that you're wrong. There's so much riding on it. There's so much pressure on you. It's so competitive. So it's really tough.
My example, one quite recently, with the 4chan incident. Right.
I think I pointed that out.
You did point that out, though. Interestingly, let's also be clear on exactly what happened. Right. So we surfaced 4chan's sort of doxing of this individual who was supposedly the Vegas shooter. Right. By the way, we surfaced this result to be also clear, because this I think was frankly not accurately portrayed in the coverage. This only surfaced against queries on that individual's name, who was really a non-entity, and it surfaced against 3,000, 4,000 queries total, right? Now, that's not to excuse it. Here's what we did right and here's what we did wrong. It was right to surface it. That content was out there on the web.
This was about the Las Vegas shooter.
This is about the Las Vegas shooter. It was right to surface it. What was incorrect, which is a flaw on our end, obviously, that we're fixing, is that we surfaced it in this top stories UI, which, one thing we always have to recognize internally is when we surface it in those kinds of UIs, it's what we call a high promise UI. It gives it a sense of endorsement that it obviously shouldn't have had, right? So that was a mistake. That was a fuck up on our part. And not surprisingly, there was no small degree of angst internally on that. But we got to learn from it. We got to communicate clearly on what went right and what went wrong, and obviously fix it. there and there. Monica?
Hi. So you mentioned something that I think we talk about all the time, which is that nothing is normal right now. Nothing is stable. And this is a very scary reality to be in. But I want to push back on that. I want to challenge that for a moment. Because when things are unpredictable, when things are unstable, that's when change happens fastest. And it can really go in any direction. So we're in this incredibly unpredictable, charged moment across society in all these different arenas, and it is full of potential. So instead of getting negative about the norms we've lost, I'd like each of you to take a moment to be sort of optimistic, or at least tell us what could journalists, what could the media do, what could platforms do to take advantage of this instability when it's easier to take risk, when it's easier to be outrageous, so that by the time we start developing norms again, they are better than the norms we had before?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it sort of speaks to the idea of a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So, I mean, one of the things that I've seen happen, and I think it's been a good development, is, you know, as journalists, we tend to, this is one example, we tend to not want to call things what they are always. You know, we're full of euphemistic language. One of the ways that that's changed during this administration is, you know, we've begun to be willing to say this is false, or even this is a lie. So the idea of being much more direct about saying things as they are, not falling into this sort of careful language. Are we representing both sides equally? I mean, that's a real change in journalistic approaches. And I think that's something that we have decided to do differently, and it will probably continue no matter who's in office.
I hope we all recognize it for the wake-up call I like to think it was. And I think it has caused a whole lot of soul-searching. You know, as I've shared with some folks, and since we're in Chatham House Rules, as I made a comment to my wife recently, I said, you know, I hate even saying this, but it's true, is that Trump has been very, very good to me, right? I mean, in the sense that internally at Google, it has raised these questions about the state of the news industry, the state of our own efforts in what we do, to very high levels of seriousness and concern. And I just hope that we all take full advantage of that. And, you know, as you know, I've always been very optimistic about the future of news and the future of journalism and what we can do. But we actually have to act. And that's, you know, actions on our part in terms of what we do to do a better job of separating the wheat from the chaff, doing what we can do to express and address, say, media literacy through our UXs. And I think also in the journalism community is how do we take and really sit back and reflect on, again, what journalism is? How do we regain trust? How do we take advantage of data to give people more statistical context so that we're not driving fear with disproportionate coverage? You know, all these questions I think are hugely important questions. And I just hope that we all, you know, take that really to heart. And if I've had one concern, just to be completely honest, over the last year is there's almost too much finger pointing. Almost too much finger pointing. You know, oh, it's the platform's fault, or oh, it's the media's fault, or oh, it's the government's fault. We all have to address these issues. And frankly, that's why we do these things, because not only we have to all address them individually, I think we all have to address them collaboratively.
Do we want to come over?
I want to ask you a question about the Weinstein effect, which I know you have written about.
I'm sorry.
A slight change in tack.
Oh, that.
That, yes. I'm just wondering how you think, with something you're doing for your column tomorrow about normalizing and scrutinizing, as you look at this as an issue, because it's going to continue, obviously, to percolate and lots of revelations and what have you, but how do you think it's going to change the conversation and change the nature of newsrooms and maybe how you do your job as well, as you look at the media almost looking at itself internally and the entertainment industry, which is, you know, we know that this is a pervasive thing across lots of industries, but at the moment, the media and entertainment industry is in the spotlight.
So, I mean, that's a very broad question, and I can't answer all aspects of it, but I will say that one of the things that, and I wrote a column about this, one of the ways that I think the media can address its own issues, which are coming to the fore, is by realizing that these issues of sexual harassment are often about power rather than sex, or maybe both, but certainly they have to do with a power imbalance, and that when we are in institutions and newsrooms and organizations that in which women don't have a lot of power and aren't at the top levels of authority or in the most influential positions, that it's going to be hard to fix it. And so I think that has to be part of the equation. And I'm sorry, that's a limited answer, but it's such a broad question, I can't get at all of it. You had a question though, right?
As somebody who constantly pokes their finger at underserved and underrepresented communities, there's a couple of issues here. One is we look at our foundation funding that looks at expediency rather than effectiveness and provides funding at a level that's secondary, that provides funding then to the local level. We are creating a subsystem of distribution of resources that is still focused on a white Caucasian focus on what's happening at the local level. That there are people who are implementing work at the local level that cannot get the platform and the visibility that they need to be able to get the funding for the work that they're doing at the local level to be able to do this work. And foundations who have provided some of the backbone and resources for this work are giving it to secondary resources who then distribute that to the local level. You need to understand that's a problematic funding model for people of color and communities of color that are underserved. First and foremost, that's a problem. Second of all, when we're looking at issues of national organizations, like whether it's Washington Post or otherwise, when we're looking at issues of diversity, it is not an issue of diversity of bringing somebody who has a military background and understanding of weaponry to the table when we have been silent and used our communities of color as Zeus stories instead of understanding the deep, nuanced ways in which they need news and information. And so as somebody who has constantly been in these forums trying to advocate for support for experimentation at the local level, I don't see my people here. I don't see the foundations recognizing that the experiments that we're doing, whether it's at HBCUs and other places, are getting the kinds of support that larger technological and other kinds of issues tend to get the focus and attention. And so my concern as somebody who has been at the forefront of this for many years, that we have two systems of funding the kind of work that's happening at the local level. And when we talk about trust and the work that's happening, whether it's through Harkin, through Journalism Matters and other places, we don't understand at a fundamental level the ways in which we have disenfranchised our audiences at a fundamental level where they do not trust us and will not turn to us for the news and information that we need, and that we need these alternative agents to come to the forefront to be able to create that. I've looked at and understood what's been happening, whether it's at Google or at the Washington Post. And the diversity that you're looking at in terms of bringing those voices to the table are not recognizing the experimentation, the power, and the voices, and recognizing the signals that are coming from communities of color and others that are saying you are not doing your work appropriately and you are doing damage. And so when we look at, and I try and frame this in a sense of news is food. Are we feeding our communities? Are we starving them with the zoo stories and the kinds of ways in which we frame poverty in Appalachia, where I am, or communities of color in a way that really don't honor the stories of the people in my community that are asking for and looking for a way not only for people to hear who we are, but helping us reflect ourselves to ourselves in a way that we can help move our communities forward. And so as we talk about this journalism environment, there's a sub-level of that we have eschewed. The chicken dinner news, the ways in which we build a sense of community and place, the ways in which we help connect residents and honor their stories as situated knowledge that we, as a profession, have said is not news and not information. And I think that has done a significant damage, especially in our rural communities, especially in our communities of color. We have said, your stories don't make a difference. And how we frame this at the national level becomes the way in which you are viewed as a lens through the global community. And so I would invite our national funders, foundation, and organizations and otherwise, that the model of parachuting into a community does not serve us long term. I have lived on both ends of Appalachia as a black person, and I don't see myself represented in those spaces. I don't see my community and the people who are struggling with just getting a grocery store in their community represented in our media. And as long as we continue to maintain this focus on a national level on our coastal communities in a way that myself, as a rural resident, as a community of color, as a person that's living in a community that doesn't look like me, we are going to continue to miss the cognitive bias that we bring to the work that we do in making a difference in these communities.
Oh.
Thank you.
Agreed. Thank you. I don't know where we are on time. I wasn't even sure what our budgeted time was.
Here, an hour easy.
I think we've been here an hour. Does anyone have a last begging question, or shall we move to the bar? The bar. Thank you, Margaret.
Thanks very much.
Joining us. Thank you for your participation.